different from what we already seen, but I think when it comes for managing risks, every country differs as well. So in the aspect of that, I would briefly speak about the risk management. The country is somewhat like, it's a population, we only have a population of 300,000. It's made up of islands, more than 1,000 islands. Only 194 islands are inhabited, and the 92 resorts, and the capital is Male. As you can see, it's made up of atolls, and then we have islands among each atolls. We do have 26 atolls. The country is less than 1 meter above sea level. I think that's one of the main challenges that we face in our country. When we look into the hazards, we could see that it's different from other type of countries. We are faced with coastal flood, tsunami, extreme heat, cyclones, earthquakes, and however these are mediums as well. We don't face normally earthquakes, but these are the hazards. We were hit by tsunami, 2004 tsunami, and then 13 islands were destroyed. 56 sustained major physical damages, as well as 2,500 houses were destroyed, and more than 3,500 others were severely damaged. As you can see from the picture, you could see an building that's actually an island where this was when we were hit by the tsunami. You could see the level of the sea rise in the impact. That was somewhat like we had a wave which was more than 2-meter wave, but the island is only less than 1 meter above sea level. So this is a big challenge when it comes for resilience in infrastructures as well. 3 islands were washed out, probably maybe because we didn't had good standards, we didn't had infrastructures, we didn't had resilient infrastructures back then. If that was the case, if we had good safety systems, if we had good standards, this might not be the case. When we look back to risk profiling, as I spoke earlier as well, every country has their own risks. Every country differs from the risks as well. Due to our geographical and the way we are, the main hazards for us is tidal waves and urban fires. What you see in the picture about that's the capital, which is like 2 kilometer by 1.5 kilometer, and the capital itself holds more than 30% of total population of the country, which means we already have more than 100,000 people living in a small area. Due to that, we are facing a lot of problems as well. Tidal waves, of course, is one which we can't control, and the other one is the urban fires. When we say urban fires, due to the fact that each fire itself is a load to the buildings as well, and due to the compact, due to the urban population on the island, we are facing that a lot. We do have, when we look into the statistics, we are facing a lot of fires, but then from 2010 to 2017, you might see the figures, it is decreasing. However, the consequences from each fire are high due to the close population. Even if there is one fire in some of the buildings, we can't just eliminate that fire. It is spreading to the other infrastructures as well, and this is imposing a lot of danger to everyone around the building itself, the occupancies in the buildings as well. So the main challenges, one of the main challenges that we are facing is the dense population. due to the constrained lands in our country, it is very difficult for us to implement any standard. Normally, the international standards, the safety standards, they are quite big when it looks into a constraint. If we put that in our country, it is quite difficult and it is quite expensive as well.
Mr. Mohammed?
Yeah.
It's
Sorry.
time, yeah.
Because of the remote islands, lack of fire safety codes. However, current practice is we are having a building code which came into act last year. Under that act, we are having different codes for different structures to make the structures more resilient as well. Currently, we do practice the international standards. Like I said, we do have, it is quite difficult when it comes to imposing these standards to our countries. But currently, we are working on amending good practices as well as resilient for these structures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I request a colleague from Bhutan to come up, please.
Good morning, everybody. With due permission of Your Excellency, Chair, Co-Chairs, and senior delegates from national, international, and my colleagues, I am Yadav Lal from Bhutan. Would like to talk few points about Bhutan. Before talking about Bhutan, I am very sure that many of here don't know where Bhutan is. I'll talk about Bhutan first. Bhutan is a landlocked country in Asia, north bordered by China and south, east and west bordered by India. It is about 38,000 square kilometer and population twice the Maldives, like 700,000. About the disaster risk scenario, during 2009 and 11 earthquake, Bhutan was affected. Some eastern part, southern part, and even it is found that active seismicity in the region. With that initiative, with the Department of Disaster Management and the ministry, with the support from the USAID, we formulated the guidelines in which we found that all damages were in rural areas. And we found that many houses were collapsed and some lives were lost. And we formulated guidelines, and now it is giving the capacity building to the local regions, like up to the village level, with engineers, technicians, and local leaders are involved. With that techniques, we have some restriction in construction in rural areas, like they can't construct building beyond 2 stories. And they need to follow the strict guidelines. Secondly, in Bhutan, we have Bhutan standard rules and regulation for the urban construction, which they need to follow the urban construction. It is incorporated with seismic activity and wind load. And thirdly, Bhutan, many hydropower projects is ongoing. In 2030, there is target of 20,000 megawatts, where there is chance of glacier burst and may cause direct impact. And government need to preparatory action for the matter. And recently there is more roadworks constructions, widening of national highways, construction of district roads, and construction of village roads, where due to terrain there is many blockage and landslides occurs in monsoon, where this is tackled in ad hoc matters, ad hoc So this also need to take in action for preparatory. Direct role is taken by the disaster management, and all districts are appointed district administrator as a direct role during the disaster, and armed forces and polices. With this, I would like to thank very much for the Government of India for organizing this workshop and getting opportunity to share our views. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now request our co-chair to make his comments as well as to take the discussion forward.
Thank you, Chairman. On behalf of the Australian Government, I would wish to acknowledge the leadership of the Indian Government and also the UNISDR in bringing together the key leaders at the forefront of thinking about demonstrating and implementing disaster risk reduction and also resilient infrastructure into the future. We're honoured to be able to contribute to this discussion about the development of disaster resilient infrastructure. But what strikes me is that no matter where we come from or what part of the globe that we originate from, is there are consistent themes emerging across this particular workshop. And that is that we're all in this process of recovering and having the conversation about how we reconstruct assets and communities after the impact of significant events. We too, in Australia, are in the process of recovery after the second most damaging cyclone across the Australian coast since records began. And what is clear is that we are all experiencing this massive climate variability in terms of duration and impact and intensities, at the same time as our ability to build bigger and more complex infrastructure is increasing. Our systems are becoming more advanced, interdependent and interrelated. And at the same time, because I'm intimately involved in this recovery process, the expectations of our communities are heightened in terms of the expectations in how quickly we can reinstate infrastructure after an event, whether it is making them more safe in the event of a new climate-based risk, and how are we reducing the cost of reconstruction and recovery for future events. These are some of the key challenges that we face in Australia, and certainly from the discussion that I have been a party to here in the last 2 days, there are obviously consistent themes across this particular group as well. A challenge in the Australian context, and I think it has been raised in a number of presentations here, is that our infrastructure networks not only deal with advanced, urbanised, very well supported communities within the economy, our cities, but it also includes rural and remote communities who also rely very, very heavily on an infrastructure network that enables them to function as a community. And so I think it's very, very important that when we talk about standards, when we talk about resourcing of capability of those technical standards of design principles, that we take into account when we're talking about resilient infrastructure, that we actually incorporate not only new infrastructure, but we also look at those existing infrastructure networks as well. So probably some of those key questions that have arisen today and also we confront regularly is how do we incorporate the growing complexity and granularity of a hazard and risk assessment into design, construction, operations and maintenance standards. Whilst this is included in most large infrastructure projects, is how do we translate those into more lower scale, smaller remote communities? Andrew Mascary made an important point yesterday, which was that we need to build models that are available to all. And I think that's very, very important for those rural and remote communities that all of us have in our particular part of the globe. Today, my 4 key takeaways from the presentations of our panel today, and hopefully that will generate a little bit of discussion, is that Professor Ayoub has conspicuously noted that rather than designing to existing national and international standards, we should think beyond standard. We should be looking at integrating resilience. He used a very, very prescient term, adaptive design principles. And I think that should underpin most of our thinking in terms of how we look at best practice guidelines rather than prescriptive guidelines. Give the ability to our designers to take into account the changing pace of the data that we're receiving in terms of climate risk. And so the question then went on to, are our operations and maintenance standards adequate for the risks we now face? And Professor Biondini made an important point that should underpin any resilient design for infrastructure, and that is we should take the complete life cycle approach. From not only design, we should go all the way through construction, also operations and maintenance, and then recovery, reconstruction, or replacement. Stefan Kohler, who has been intimately involved in the delivery of projects throughout the world, suggested that we need to take that systems approach. Importantly, what stood out for me is that we not only dealt with the asset themselves, that we dealt with those soft parts of the equation, the knowledge bank and the institutions. And it's probably something that we need to touch on and explore further in maybe further discussions. Is that how do we develop that capability amongst our engineers, amongst our standards, and how do we actually identify best practice throughout the world and export that sort of capability to other parts of the world that require it? And Dr. Shaw finally indicated that taking that multidisciplinary approach should underpin any strategy for increasing the resilience of infrastructure, including a conversation about land use planning, including that introducing and including the conversation about what is climate science telling us about the state our operations and maintenance and our standards should look like. And also the disaster management sector, as well as the engineering sector. This multidisciplinary approach should underpin our investment in resilient infrastructure into the future. So they were the 4 key takeaways I had from the presentation today. What I would like to do is open the discussion to the floor, because I think we have many, many contributors here, especially on the importance of design, the operations and maintenance posture we take for our particular infrastructure networks.
Can somebody help her with the mic, please?
Hello, hi, good morning. I'm Anna Bruni. I'm a chartered civil engineer and I'm also a trustee of the Habitat Foundation. My question to the panel today is around what can we do to prepare ourselves for unknown risks. So I was really pleased to hear some of the panelists explode some of the challenges that designers and engineers face in preparing and sort of setting the targets that we plan for our structures, and also some of the opportunities that we can exploit when we foresee some of the risks, and therefore we set a good design basis. But what can we do to prepare ourselves for the scenarios where, for no fault of a structure or of a piece of infrastructure, the context changes, and therefore the baseline conditions that the structure was designed for and the way it's operated are no longer suitable? And where does that responsibility lie? Does it lie with the operators of the structure, or does it lie with, for example, the agencies managing change? I think a similar example was mentioned yesterday in relation to a dam, where the outflow allowed for the dam that was planned for might have been different to the capacity downstream that was changing. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I could see a role for adaptive design if the design has appropriate features to enable changes in it with a reasonable level of costs. I think this could maybe address changes in the requirements as well as in the operations. It doesn't really address all the potential scenarios here, but it could offer a way to deal with a good number of them. And this could be done through a deliberate design early on, where those potential changes are examined and considered during the design stage.
we have been discussing about the recurring losses we have been incurring. And the standards and what you have been discussed here will help all the countries to at least minimize these things. And these standards what are developed in various countries, how they are being available globally to the various agencies. I hope there is no commercial aspects involved in this compared with the losses we are incurring at the country level. So how to make these things available easily, like today we have Google Maps, where every person can access it and benefit from that. The design standards, the maintenance practices, how to make them available to each country or to the individuals so that we can minimize these losses.
I think that, and it's a good question, and we have had this comment in some of the countries we work where there is this issue of access to standards. And I think one of the things we're trying to do as a UN agency is develop best practice guidelines internally that we can then share with countries and member states to use. And UNOPS has developed a set of guidelines around prisons, for example. We're doing infrastructure as well, bridges, roads, which draws on some of that knowledge from around the globe to do that, to make it available. But I believe there are some challenges with that, and I have heard this from people in Nepal, the same thing, that accessing some of the standards becomes costly. But obviously there's a cost associated with maintaining the standards and with keeping them up to date, and the sort of infrastructure needed to maintain them. So we have to obviously understand that and how we balance that. But certainly we are working on that to make those kinds of things available.
This is a very good question. Let me just give you additional information on the way ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers, operates. ASCE, when we undertake a project to prepare standards, is done all by volunteers. So basically in the manual of practice that we are working on, we had about 12 individuals volunteering to draft it. They have no financial interests or gains out of this other than maybe professional advancement. Now for the society, for ASCE, they will end up selling it as a book, as a document, and that's not really I don't think it can be offered free of charge, and the reason behind it, ASCE has a staff to maintain and so on. There are basic costs they have to be maintained. So those standards, they tend to be offered for some nominal charge. I mean, they're not that expensive, and they could be available through institutions. If there is a library for a university and so on, most of the time they have institutional subscriptions and they have access to such documents.
The lady there first, please, and then...
Is it on? So my question was basically about the multi-governance system in relation to India, and perhaps Professor Murthy, you could help answer this question. So yesterday we talked about how local capacity was missing, but we didn't really address the fact that, and I can only really speak about the case of India, that there are legal frameworks in place where the central government has authority over some things, for example, national highways in India, but that national highway, when you're driving across it, will go off into a state road at one point, and the central government does not have any authority over that state road because that is a state subject. Now, does that come down to the state not having capacity? Does that come down to the center not coordinating with the state, or does that just come down to this is the state subject, this is the center subject, and this is just how it is? And is the only solution an amendment to the Constitution, or are there better ways to do it? And this is something perhaps you could answer.
Okay.
Thank you.
Since she has given it to me directly. National Highways Authority, when the land is given for development of roads and the bridges along that, is also given the authority to execute it from end to end. So there's no conflict per se with any state or rural road or anything. It just has the full right of way defined, and it can do the full design and construction by itself. So there's no conflict that way. When national highways, same is the case with Indian Railways. Oh, sure, that continues. There's an owner, and the owner is responsible for that. Sure. So there's need for coordination, that is clear. There's need for coordination. Often that is where the emphasis has to be laid, and we have to work harder on that. Yeah.
Sir.
Where's the next question? Right here? Right here.
Yeah, thank you. I think the other issue, which I don't think's been perhaps raised at the table, is what happens in contexts where you have the standards exist, you have highly trained engineers who understand the standards, but what is actually built then doesn't conform to what was in the design. So actually what I'm saying is what happens in the whole process between the design and actually the infrastructure existing. Certainly I was a senior advisor to the Peruvian government in the second half of last year in the reconstruction after the floods. And most of the problems we were facing weren't actually on the lack of standards. The problems was in the procurement process, particularly at the local level, and then the different sort of changes, let's say informal changes to designs that happened between the original design and the construction happening. So I think there's a series of, let's say, institutional issues, particularly at the level of local administrations, which can quite easily, let's say, pervert the original intention of the standards and the design, which then may mean that what, at least on paper, might seem to be resilient infrastructure when it's built is not resilient infrastructure. So there's a sort of, let's say, outside of the realm of the engineering professions, there's the whole other realm of public administration, which I think we also have to look at in terms of how the whole system works, which I think is a point that Stefan made in his presentation.
I think it's obviously a very critical question, because I think this is something that, I've seen personally in countries where you're right, there's a very strong national building code. It's used by the engineering profession to do the designs, and then when that design is handed to a contractor to implement, then the capacity of the contracting community to actually do the implementation according to the design for multiple reasons is not there. Or sometimes there's a financial incentive not to comply with the design because it's perceived to be too expensive. And then shortcuts are taken. And I think this comes down to two real big issues. The one is the issue of quality assurance and quality control and how we actually do that. And the other one is you're right. I think it's part of the institutional component of the systems. And the institutions is not just the designer of the assets, but it's also those institutions that construct them, that work with them, that own them and operate them. Because we've also seen where even if the design is constructed to code, the way the building, for example, is operated is not to code. And that's just as big as a problem. So there needs to be kind of institutional strengthening across all the areas, not just the constructors or the designers of the assets. But it is a real issue. That causes us major problems.
Yeah, just to supplement, I think the way I see it is it's like a nutrition guide and a recipe or a cookbook. At certain stage, we need to have very specific nutrition guide, which will possibly give us the broader perspective. And that is very much related to the technical standard. But when we actually implement that standard, I think this is more like a recipe or the cookbook that how at different country, different context, they actually do that. And yes, I fully agree with what Stefan had pointed out and in his presentation as well as your comment. And there possibly we have lots of new innovations or lots of issues which can be shared across the country. So one of my biggest wish and expectation from this conference also would be that when we talk about this DRI, Disaster Resilient Infrastructure Alliance, at certain point possibly we need to think about some mechanism that how we can share not only just the success stories, but some of how we can learn from the failures. So I think that would be a very, very important issue.
Okay, so that will be the last two questions.
Sir,
One
yeah.
there.
Sir, I am representing Tata Power. We are supplying power to Mumbai. This is power utility. And power business is heavily regulated. Those who have got standard, we want to implement the standard. We have to go to a regulator, and regulator normally sees it should be economy because this is a public service. So how to implement the standard, plus how to give this service to people with the economics. That is a challenge which we are facing. So we request all these delegates from national, international, that they should, through government policies or through regulatory policies, they should make people understand that our infrastructure should be disaster resilience, and it will implement it to regulatory regulator to these standards.
Okay. So that was more like a suggestion, but anybody wants to respond? Yeah, sure, please.
I could see that, thank you for your question. I could see that there are almost three layers. One is policy, and the policy will drive the regulation. The standard creation community is really separate. They will offer those standards, and it's left up to the regulator to adopt them. At least that's the way it works in the US. For example, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that regulates the design and construction of nuclear power plants, they have the say and the authority whether they should adopt the ASME standard. So it's very common that NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they might be in a time lag behind the standard, the ASME standard. The ASME standard might be, let's say, the version that is 2015, while the regulator is still adopting the 2003 version of that standard. There is a time lag of this type. But NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, will be responding to the policy that's set by law. Thank you.
So we'll go to the last question on the floor. Okay, if not, I'll request Brendan Moon to close the session, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I think we're all agreed that more resilient infrastructure, the systems that support it, are what we seek to achieve. But I think importantly what today's session has certainly identified, that there are three key components to that. It's about understanding asset performance, it's about having those standards that support how they will behave during a disaster, but also importantly, and I think I highlighted the need for further engagement in subsequent workshops, is that knowledge and institutional piece is that if we're truly to have disaster resilient infrastructure, then we certainly need to look at how we actually capture those lessons. Best practice, capture them, deliver them to areas that need them most. And institutionally, we've touched on it, how do we actually ensure that disaster resilient infrastructure is delivered within the policy settings and the funding settings that we currently have? I'd like to thank all the contributors here from the panel. They've certainly given us the benefit of their many, many years in this space, and I'd certainly appreciate the engagement from the attendees at the workshop in the Q&A session. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, everyone.
Now I invite everyone for tea and coffee and request to kindly reassemble in 15 minutes.
Okay, can I request all of you to come over, please? Please come.